Hi, Moody Life Science students. Mr. Eaton here again, week 10. I don't know about you, but this semester just seems to be flying by. We're looking on the leeward side now of about 5 or 6 weeks left. Counting this week, it would be 6, and it goes quickly. And so I want to bring to your attention during this week one thing that I really like to have you consider. And if you read the opening announcement before looking at this, you'll know where I'm coming from. Each week, or every 2 weeks actually, I try to lay our emphasis on the particular lesson that would be in sequence with that time period. And so as we're entering into week 10, this would be week 9 and week 10 would be our emphasis would be looking at lesson 5, Frontiers in Science. Now, I realize that a number of you are ahead of that, and you're looking at lessons 6, 7, and a couple of you have even finished lesson 8, and you're working toward your term papers or your interactive journal projects, and others of you are not quite up to lesson 5 yet, and you got a little bit later start and you're just beginning to move through the lessons. One of the things about a self-paced course is it's very easy to get in and just race through the material without really stopping to consider, why are we studying this? What is this material and why is it included in this course of study? Now, science to many of you may not seem all that important in a biblical studies major of any kind, or if you're working toward becoming a full-time pastor or going into full-time youth ministry, or something along those areas. If you happen to be looking at moving into TESOL and teaching English to speakers of other languages, other places in the world, or even here in America, some of the things we deal with in science may not seem all that relevant. But as we look at lesson 5 and we're dealing with frontiers in science, I hope you will be able to grasp the really deep significance of this, because it's actually dealing with the essence of life itself. Frontiers in Science, for those of you that haven't looked at it yet, will be covering or is covering issues in genetic engineering. It covers a little bit more on the Human Genome Project and its importance. That's more in lesson 4, but there are some areas in lesson 5 that touch on the HGP and its significance to us today. But in genetic engineering, we're talking about cloning. We're talking about reproductive cloning, which is actually bent on producing another not a human being necessarily, but another organism of the exact same genetic makeup as one from which the material is taken and cloned into another egg. There's therapeutic cloning, which is designed for improvement of health and well-being, and not for the purpose of producing a whole other organism. The example in the text of Dolly the sheep is probably the most prominent. Dolly was the first successful cloning of a sheep, and Dolly was an exact copy of the female sheep from which her DNA was taken. Now, you could say, well, the other sheep was her mother. No, the other sheep from which the DNA was taken was her identical twin. And being that the other sheep was already born, the other sheep, though an identical twin, was a little bit older than Dolly. Dolly lived a fairly normal life as a sheep, but it is still a controversial topic and one that you want to be aware of. We're talking about really playing God in terms of tampering with the essence of life. In terms of therapeutic cloning, though, for the cloning things, we're talking about cloning body parts for a person, for example, who's lost a hand or a foot or an ear or some other part of the body that can be cloned from the person's own DNA, and when then surgically reattached, will not be rejected in all likelihood by the body because it is identical DNA. We're also talking about gene therapy, which is different from therapeutic cloning. Gene therapy is the practice of taking healthy genes and replacing damaged or diseased genes in a person's system with the healthy genes. Now, there is a trick question in lesson 5, and that is, has there ever been a successful example of gene therapy? And the truth of the matter is, there has not. There have been some operations or some genetic therapy that has been successful for a time. But the big problem is that in several cases, the individual who receives the therapeutic gene has died. In other cases, the person has ended up succumbing to other maladies that were caused by the gene therapy. So in your book, it's a little confusing because it talks about some successful gene transplants going on, gene replacement therapy, but in reality, it hasn't been highly successful. And so it's a kind of a confusing answer, and I give a lot of leeway on the answer there because it depends on how you interpret the reading in the lesson. There have been advancements, by the way, in gene therapy since our textbook came out, and with the 8th edition, which we should be using, it's actually the latest edition of the text by Treffel and Hazen. You can do some research for this later on if you wish on the internet. And other areas of gene therapy, heritage, I don't think I'd call it heritage tampering, but certainly attempting to approach the time period when couples can choose the sex of their baby, the hair color, the eye color, the health, the physique, the mental capacities of the child based on genetic makeup. That's still science fiction, and it's still in the future. However, we are approaching that area, and it's quite scary because God has things to say about that in His Word. So I'm going to leave it with that, but that's what we're talking about in Frontiers in Science. I like to call it science fiction views of the future, possible future. Whether we'll get there or not is still up in question. But I do want to make sure, I know my video is going a little longer this week, but I wanted to make sure that I covered that with you so you understood exactly what Lesson 5 is dealing with and the theological implications. And yes, there are theological implications, and I hope that you will take the time to pray on it and to further your study, take the time to dig into this one, and make sure you understand what parts of the reading are definite and what parts of the reading actually are still a little bit speculative. Even though they would like to declare that thus and so has occurred, you might want to really take it with a grain of salt. That's all for this week, and I wish you a blessed fall. I hope you're enjoying some of the fall weather. We're riding high right now because Washington State won Saturday on ESPN's Game of the Week, and so Eastern Washingtonians are a little euphoric right now. It was a good game. But there are a lot of things to be aware of as we enter into this fall season, and as we enter into the time getting close to Halloween. I hope you'll give some real thought to the implications of Halloween in our day and age. It's not the innocent holiday it once was, for example, when I was a child. We'll have more. I'll talk to you more later this week, but for now, God bless to all of you and Godspeed on your work.